This afternoon's session brings us to section 5, which is concerned with hierarchies. Joy said this morning that her session was going to be somewhat easier than the session which had preceded it. I can say with confidence that mine will be more difficult. I approached this whole section with some fear and trembling, because it is not an easy section and not an easy area to understand, or even to begin to understand. It is complex, confusing, and I have tried in the book to distill from the information some of what I have regarded as the important points concerning this from a particular perspective. So we will try and do what we can, though I do warn you that, do as I may, I cannot make this easy. Nothing I can do will make this easy. I'm minded of, talking of making things easy, I'm reminded, quite why, I'm not too sure, of a little line I read somewhere which was talking about research into the nature of the brain. The brain, as you will appreciate, is extremely complicated. And the little sentence just said, if the brain was simple enough to understand, we'd be too simple to understand it. And I rather feel that this is the case with hierarchies. If the hierarchies were simple enough to be understood, we'd be too simple to understand them. However, as we've been told more than once, just because it's difficult is no cause for despondency, is it? In business, they came out with a phrase which made me laugh a little while ago. They said there are no such thing as problems; there are merely opportunities. So this isn't a problem; it's an opportunity for you. The way that I have attempted to present this particular subject, hierarchies, in the book is what we in the trade would call a top-down approach, which is to start from the heart of cosmos and review very briefly the stages in the unfolding of cosmos. I noticed Anthony was saying unfoldment earlier today. Is unfoldment a word? Or is this one that you have invented? Unfolding, I would have said. However, the universe is unfolding from within outwardly, and in this process, the various hierarchies that we refer to appear. Now, why, you might ask, in a book on cyclic evolution, do we even have to consider the hierarchies at all? And to state the end at the beginning, I would ask you to look at one of the last passages which I have quoted in this particular section. And to do this, you will have to turn to page 77. Section 5.7, towards the bottom of page 77. There are two passages which are quoted here, which are in fact adjacent to one another in the text, and we can consider them both together. It is really the second of the two at the bottom of the page which is the important one, but in order to understand the grammar, why it starts with so, you have to read the first part first. It is a comparison. Like A, so B is what it's saying. So the first paragraph is saying, like each of the 7 regions of the earth, each of the 7 firstborn, this is referring to the humanity of our round in the first race, each of the 7 firstborn, the primordial human groups, receives its light and life from its own special dhyani physically. Especial dhyani physically. So, in other words, as well as that, so with every man, that's you, and every man in man, which phrase is explained to mean each principle in man. Each, so that's each man and each principle in man, each gets its specific quality from its primary, the planetary spirit. Therefore, every man is a septenate. Septenate just means he has 7 aspects, is sevenfold. Every man is a septenate, or a combination of principles. Each, that is each principle, having its origin in a quality of that special dhyani. Now that is, as I say, stating the end at the beginning. If we are to study cyclic evolution as it relates to man, then this, it seems to me, is a vitally important statement. It comes quite early in volume 2. There is another passage I would draw your attention to without reading on page 78, where a similar statement is made. Now, if this is the case, if every principle in our constitution draws its quality from, owes its nature to, such a dhyani, or as we shall see, ultimately a hierarchy of beings or dhyanis, then it is prudent for us to study something of the nature of these dhyanis. What does it mean to be told that the principles derive from, are an expression of, the qualities of those dhyanis? Hence the reason for trying to set forth in this particular section something of the family tree, the genealogy of these hierarchies. But it's not an easy task. The hierarchical nature of cosmos is the place that I chose to start, and I've quoted you a passage with which some of you may well be familiar anyway, which is referred to on page 68, the first paragraph, 1 and 2, one of the points from the summary, I believe. Yes, one of the points from the summary. The universe is worked and guided from within outwards. The whole cosmos is guided and controlled and animated by an almost endless series of hierarchies of sentient beings, each having a mission to perform, and it goes on to say more about that. This is the basic statement. It's so fundamental that she puts it in her list of summarized points at the end of part 1 of volume 1. She regards this as, what shall we say, one of the fundamental characteristics of the cosmic process. Now, there are 2 things that we need to, I think, try and establish if we can. Firstly, a little about what we mean by hierarchy here, and then try and grasp a little of what we mean by the beings involved. One of the things which is really difficult about this whole area is that we have so little in our experience which directly relates to this. In what we've talked about so far in these sessions, man, the kingdoms of nature, the globe, the planet, and even the cycles, in each of these areas there was something in your experience which related to this. You know about 4 of the 7 kingdoms of nature. You know about the globe on which we live, in which we live, and you know about the cyclic nature of existence to a degree. You have the beginnings of an understanding anyway. When it comes to these hierarchies, it is much more difficult, because that to which we are referring is outside our immediate physical experience, and therefore we have to look around us to try and find certain analogies to explain a little bit about it and try and grasp something of their character. Firstly, the hierarchical nature. This can be very misleading. We are familiar with hierarchies in one form or another. Society may be arranged in a hierarchical fashion. Businesses may be arranged in a hierarchical fashion with the managing director at the top, and underneath him the board of directors, and underneath him a series of managers and supervisors and so forth. An analogy that Madame Blavatsky uses is also there of an army with its major generals at the top and its chain of command underneath it, leading down to the soldiers at the bottom and so forth. Well, this is something we're familiar with, but the sort of hierarchy that we're concerned with in cosmos, it seems, is significantly different from that. For a start, it is leaderless. Rather surprisingly, it is leaderless. If we were to assume that the cosmic hierarchical structure was similar to earthly ones, we would expect that corresponding to the managing director or the major general or whoever it is that leads up the hierarchy, so there ought to be somebody in cosmos who was there at the center of cosmos and was technically the hierarch, who is the guy at the top of it all. There isn't one. Not only that, rather disturbingly, but there isn't even a board of directors, because the first 7 who appear in the cosmic process of the one becoming the many cease to exist after a while in a rather disturbing fashion. And it seems that our hierarchy is not only headless, but director-less. The top levels don't exist in the process. In terms of the cosmic process, there never was a one which we could identify as a being anyway. We can talk of the logos, if we will, but it would be a dangerous mistake to fall into the pattern of thinking that the logos was the managing director, because, as Yanthi was saying earlier today, if there is a one, there would have to be another. And this is not the case. He is the one without a second. There's a lovely little Zen aphorism where the student asks the teacher, "What is the nature of the one?" And he replies, "You make it two." Which is, if I may paraphrase what Yanthi was saying today, exactly the same. This is the one without a second. Now, this one becomes the many. Well, the first stage in it becoming the many is symbolized by becoming 7. From the one light, as it says in one of the commentaries, 7 lights. The process goes on from each of the 7 times 7, and then the process rolls on outwardly from there. But what of these first 7? Well, she refers to these in a number of places, and I've given you passages which describe these in the commentaries. She refers to them in one place as the Arhi, the primordial 7, and so forth. And having spent a little time describing them, then we are told, rather surprisingly, and I've quoted this for you on page 70 in section 5.4, if you want to follow it originally from the Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge, the questioner asks her about these primordial 7, or the Arhi, and the questioner says, "Then the Arhi of this Manvantara?" And she answers, "Exist no longer." And I remember distinctly the first time I read that came as a very considerable shock. It was not expected. They exist no longer. They have long ago become planetary, solar, lunar, and lastly incarnating egos. They have become all of those things. They exist in and through them, but they no longer exist as themselves. For as said, they are the collective hosts of spiritual beings. And it is this collectivity which is the presentation that we are left with. The process is a collective process of building, constructing, emanating, and so forth. It is a cooperative process. The term frequently used, interestingly enough, also for this initial creative impulse is a term which you find in religious literature. They refer to the demiurge or the demiurgos as if it were a single thing. In a place which I cannot now identify, I remember seeing a derivation of this which surprised me. It said it came from the Greek, and it would use two words from the Greek, demos, meaning the people, and urgos, meaning work. So it was the work of the people, in other words, a collective work, not the work of an individual. Democracy at the highest level, you might say. Not that that would please Plato. The process then rolls out from here, and as we will see, innumerable orders of being emerge from this initial sunburst. Of these first 7, what can we say? Almost nothing, frankly. You remember that diagram that I drew you on the first day, where I started with 1 circle and I showed it gradually expanding into 7 circles. This, for what it's worth, is a symbol which I think you can use for the emergence of the primordial 7 as well. It is as if whatever the 1 was expands into a 7-fold something. It would be a mistake, I think, to think of these as conscious beings, entities. She never refers to them in these ways and avoids those sorts of terms. She uses words like forces and so forth to explain the nature of the primordial 7. But from these, as we've just read, come all sorts of beings, solar, planetary, and so forth, as she has said. And lastly, you and I, incarnating egos. We are part and parcel of this process. A very crude analogy that occurred to me some while ago, which you are welcome to try out if you like, is the refining of oil. Imagine that you start out with your crude oil, which represents your primordial 1 nature. What happens when you refine it? Well, as you refine it, what they say in the oil industry is that it becomes fractioned. In other words, you, by a process of chemical separation, you separate out the various components which are within that crude oil. And first of all, the lightest fractions come off, which are the paraffins and so forth, and petrols and whatever else. And then gradually the lighter oils, and then the medium oils, and finally you're left with the heavy oils and the sludges and whatever else which are left at the bottom. Imagine, if you will, that this process of the 7, the primordial 7, becoming solar, planetary, and, as she says, incarnating egos, is rather like this process of fractioning crude oil. Those who come off first, the lighter ones, the paraffins, are your higher order solar beings or cosmic hierarchies, and those who come off a little later, lower down the scale, your light oils, perhaps are your planetary, and then your medium oils and so forth, until you get down to the bottom end of it, to the sludge. And the heavy fractions drop out the bottom, and that's us, perhaps. Well, it's just an analogy. Make of it as much or as little as you will. Ordinary terms, as I've used them already, that of business, that of an army, is that successive orders are emanated one from within another. It's rather as if the managing director begat the board of control, emanated the board of control, was responsible for them, and then the board of control or the board of directors was responsible for generating the next layer of managers, and they emanated from them, the supervisors, and so it worked its way out until you ended up with the workers, rather than them all just being there and being organized into some sort of structure. So that is something that we'll illustrate a little later on as we get there. But I think that's an important thing to realize, that this is a process one from within another. But having said that they are emanated one from within another, having been so emanated, having been born as separate entities, they then take on, it seems, a separate and individual life of their own. And the only analogy that I can immediately think of here is that of human birth, the relationship of mother to child. The child initially is part of the fabric of the mother, quite literally part of the fabric of. Flesh of her flesh, bone of her bone, as it says, and up until the moment of birth is physiologically part of the mother's system, gradually becoming more separate, even within the womb, but then at the moment of birth it takes on an independent existence. Having done so, it's now under its parental control during its childhood and adolescence. But gradually, it becomes independent of its parents and becomes a responsible entity in its own right. And depending on its education, so it may take more or less notice of what its parents had to say, but now it functions independently. So with the hierarchies, or the beings, born within the fabric of, within the body of, within the aura of, a higher order being. They are its progeny, its offspring. And having become its offspring, they are, to that degree, independent of it. It's not then a rigid hierarchy. Do you see what I mean? It's not a static pyramid which is coming out like this. Having emanated at one level, this level moves about, just as children leave parents and wander about in the world, remembering their origins, but no longer necessarily under their control. So it is, it seems, with the hierarchies. One other analogy perhaps suggests itself here too, and that is the relationship during incarnation, as it's explained to us, between the higher ego and the lower ego, the individuality and the personality. Each personality born of the individuality, the reincarnating ego, is quite separate and independent of it. The higher ego is responsible, we are told, because it has endowed this particular personality with its thinking principle and therefore its ability to choose and discriminate. But having so emanated it, the personal entity thus born, you and I, is independent of that parent source from which it came. It's just another analogy to show the independence of the entities born from within the fabric of the higher order, whatever they might be. And this leads to the considerable complexities. It is not a hierarchy as we would have thought of it perhaps if we had been living in the 19th century, or in other centuries perhaps, where society was rigidly stratified, and whoever was at the top rigidly controlled whoever was underneath him, and he controlled in turn whoever was underneath him. This is a much more fluid structure with much more interplay. This is the feel that I get from what we see. In terms of the cosmic process, then, leading us on to where I want to get us to, we've talked very briefly about the primordial seven, about whom I have nothing to say. The secret doctrine then goes on to talk about what it terms the second seven. And these are termed the Lipica, and you can read the details about the Lipica in the secret doctrine. She calls them the scribes, those who record the karmic register and so forth. All of these are just so many images and symbols. But little, frankly, was told us about these entities. However, they are an order nearer to man, but are concerned, directly concerned, with man and his well-being. Now, before we go on, another aside, another interjection. When we talk of these many hierarchies of beings, what can we possibly know of their nature? They are, we are told, beings. Certainly the orders with which we are going to be concerned are separate, individual, conscious, self-conscious beings. But what can we know of anything of their nature? If we were to try and think of them in terms of externality, in other words, how would they appear to us in objective terms, there is almost nothing that we can say. Almost nothing. Nothing that's worthwhile. People have tried to picture these entities to themselves, and some of this has become quite ridiculous. They imagine them as angelic beings with man-like, with faces, glowing bodies and the like. This is merely an effort, no more than that, an effort on the part of human nature to try and make such entities more approachable to us. But this would be to limit them to the worlds of form as we know it. And these beings, for the most part, are not concerned with the worlds of form as we understand it. They are not concerned with what appeal to us as sensory input. They are not concerned with colour, sound, taste, smell, and those sorts of characteristics which appeal to our five senses. Certainly not in that way. So we're left with almost nothing to grasp in terms of trying to think of these as beings objective outside ourselves. Supposing we do it the other way around. Supposing we try to picture these beings as it might be to be one. I think this would be a rather more bold way to look at it and to imagine what might be the nature of their consciousness. A number of these, virtually all of these beings that we talk about here are creators. Now, with the warning that was entered earlier today about the word create, these are not creators of something out of nothing, that for sure, but their nature is nonetheless part of the construction of cosmos. So we can perhaps begin to grasp something of the nature of their consciousness. Suppose you were such a creator. What do we have in our psychological consciousness which might be analogous to this? Well, I suggest the one thing that you have which is absolutely analogous is your power of creative imagination. We have to take all this with a pinch of salt, as we say, because everything that we can creatively imagine is largely based on the images are derived from our five senses. That which we remember, that which we imagine, mostly is based on sensory data. But nonetheless, we can do it, can we not? Close your eyes, if you will, just for a moment, and if I ask you to remember what your bedroom is like, either here or at home, instantly you can call up a picture of your bedroom. You have, in your imagination, created it, and there it stands. Suddenly it has taken on characteristics. It has length. You can imagine yourself with a ruler measuring your bed if you wish to do that. You may feel the texture of the sheets and the blankets or whatever it is that you use. You can smell the flowers which are in the vase on the mantelpiece, whatever it happens to be. You suddenly are a creator. You have imagined. Now, this is real. It is of a different order of reality from this table and the chair and this room, but nonetheless it is real. Now, dismissing that image, but staying with your eyes closed, if you will, for a moment, suddenly it all becomes dimensionless again. Now suddenly whatever it is that you're left with is not measurable. has no quality. Where did it all come from? Well, where did this memory, where did the whatever it is that you evoked and built suddenly as so many images, where did it come from? Well, clearly it came from within whatever your being is. Some faculty, some power, however you will, has evoked that, and for a while it has become a reality. In your case it was only momentary, because you dismissed it again. Now, imagine, if you will, that is analogous to the processes used by the creators, these hierarchies of Dayan Chohans who are responsible for bringing the world and so forth into being. Supposing it is very similar to this in principle, if not in detail. This is as nearly as I can come to grasping something of their nature. Now, while you were doing that creative imagination exercise, and while you had for a moment forgotten your body, you had no shape. Whatever you felt yourself to be had no particular shape. Was shape important? To try and work out what the shape of a Dayan Chohan is, what its external characteristics might be, is as meaningless as to try and wonder, while you are with your eyes closed and imagining, what shape you are. You aren't any shape. It makes no sense to think in terms of shape, but you are certainly a being with a creative faculty, which you are in that limited environment exercising. I think using these parallels, we can infer something of the nature of these creative hierarchies. You have to be extremely careful not to read too much into this, but the principle, why not, after all? If the macrocosm is reflected in the microcosm and vice versa, and if, as we are so constantly told, that the principles are the same throughout the whole, why should it not be so? I leave you with this thought to ponder. Moving down the scale and closer to home, so to speak, I have detailed a little bit in section 5.6 something of the next order of beings as it relates to the creative process in relation to our planet, our solar system, and indeed man. The section in part 1 on page 15 is relatively short, and I have merely told you a little bit about this group. I have given you a large extract of this in the second part, in part 3. And I hope I'm not stealing Joy's thunder here, because this comes from stanza 7, which she tells us she is going to devote next week to. So perhaps I won't say too much about it. But this all comes from the commentary to sloka 1 of stanza 7, where these 12 hierarchies of creative powers are enumerated. Now, interestingly, we have moved from a 7-fold pattern now down to a 12-fold pattern. Perhaps an echo of what Yanthi was talking about this afternoon in terms of this number pattern. What we read into that remains to be seen. This 12-fold pattern is 12 successive orders of creative beings, each born from within the fabric of the other. And there is very little that we can say about them in detail, but there are very suggestive passages which just indicate something of this. I'm really just picking out one or two phrases here, no more. So, for instance, on page 72, talking of the second of these groups, this is a passage which has got a number 2 next to it, if you want to follow it. At this divine flame, the One, are lit 3 descending groups. Having their potential being in the higher group, they now become distinct and separate entities. Just that. That's all that I want you to look at the moment. Having their potential being in the higher group, they now become distinct and separate entities. In this process of emanation from within outwardly, their potential being was there in the higher group. The possibility of their existence was already foreshadowed, but only in the process of emanation from within outwardly did they take on distinct, separate existence, and therefore exist to perform whatever their function might be. Similar themes emerge in the other passages, but I don't think I will dwell on that too much. The reason for introducing these 12 hierarchies of creative powers at all doesn't really appear at all obviously until we get a long way down the scheme of things, and not until we get down to what would it be, numbers 9 and 10 in the scheme of things, do we get any reference to man in reality at all. Within this 12, a division of a higher 5, who are not talked about at all, and a lower 7 are discussed. The numbering really refers only to the lower 7. Of these lower 7, there is a further division of 3 and 4, and it's really only the latter 4, so the bottom of the bottom, you might say, which deals with man at all. And it talks about the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th of these groups as having some relationship to man. Of the 4th, discussed on page 74, it says, this is the highest group among the rupas, atomic forms, she explains. It is the nursery of the human, conscious, spiritual soul. Now, the term, it is the nursery of, has to be taken careful note of here. Does not mean that they are the human spiritual souls. It means that they provide the environment from which, in which, they may be nurtured and gestated, just as a nursery is a place for a child in which it is for a time confined and in which it matures and grows. So, in the same sense, this hierarchy is a nursery within which what will become the human spiritual soul is nurtured and fostered. With the 5th group, described on page 75, we are directly concerned. As she explains, within this 5th group of the lower 7, it is from these that we derive our thinking principle. Our minds, our egos are directly derived from this group. It is they who endow man with his conscious thinking principles and make of him the self-conscious entity that he becomes on this globe. With those, we are certainly concerned. The last groups, the 6th and 7th, moving downward in the scale, are again concerned with man, and from these we derive some of our lower principles, and is concerned with the physical stream of our development, and is concerned with the establishment of a physical material vehicle, being body, through which the other principles may operate. These 12 she spends a lot of time in that Sloka 1 talking of. But that's the only place she does talk about them. And having gone to those lengths, she never really makes reference to the subject again. It's interesting. You have to make the most of what information is given at particular points, if you will. And these are passages which you really need to brood over, mull on, and take to your heart and think over for a long time. They're not things which fall into neat patterns which we can extract in an easy fashion. So these are the 12 hierarchies of creative powers which are solar in scope. She identifies these with the 12 signs of the zodiac as it relates to our solar system. So although they have a relationship to man and this globe and his evolution, presumably their scope is much larger and are concerned with much else besides in our solar system. Continuing this theme of becoming closer and closer to home, there are hierarchies which are much more intimately concerned with man, and these are the ones which are extensively referred to in Volume 2 of the Secret Doctrine. These go under a variety of different names. There are two broad categories within this area. Those who she refers to as the solar Petries literally fathers or progenitors, and those she calls the lunar fathers or progenitors or Petries. Solar and lunar are contrasted here, I believe, merely to indicate inner and outer, spiritual and material, groups which are concerned with the spiritual aspects of man and the more material aspects of man. Again, this group, which is much more intimately and much more closely concerned with man and only man, and has no other function to perform in the scheme of things, are again hierarchies of creative powers of different and lower order, and these, as I say, much more distinctly related. And it is these ultimately who come down to that passage that I started with when we described the nature of man, the 7 principles in his constitution, each being derived from such a group of creators. Now, it's a rather fascinating pattern that we end up with. And if you permit me to wander a little way from the subject, not very far, perhaps we can explore something of the implications of all this. I cannot expect you to get too excited about these hierarchies unless you can see something of their significance as it relates to us as individuals. And it seems to me the key to that is that last passage that I first read out, which comes towards the end of the section, where it talks about each of man's 7 principles as being related to these hierarchies of beings. Now, I believe that in order to understand this and to make some sense of this, we have to take another look at what we understand by the nature and constitution of man. Now, I don't really want to, as we say in English, teach my grandmother to suck eggs. I don't want to teach you what you already know about the constitution of man, but perhaps look at it again in a slightly different light. There is much confusion about the term principle and vehicle. It's a point which I have made later in the book. I think I've made it in section 9.3. Or thereabouts. No, wrong. Not the other part in 9.3. Yes, on page, if you want to follow my idea here, there's a paragraph 9.3 in part 2, it's on page 99, where I have discussed this and have tried to sort out something of the discrepancy in this use of these terms, principle and vehicle, as it relates to man. It's not, I think, too difficult to grasp the idea that the principle represents the essence, the fundamental quality of whatever aspect of our being it refers to, and the vehicle is the mode of manifestation wherein that principle operates. If you want to put it simply, the life and the form. But remember that we're dealing with a nature which is not dual, and although we may talk of life and form, these are not fundamentally different, different in degree, but only different in degree. However, for purposes of analysis, we may, for the moment, I think, separate them, at least in our thinking, always with that warning, that caveat at the back. Man, then, is seven-principled, we say. There is a lovely image which is used, and again I'm probably stealing Joy's material here, from stanza 7, where it talks about the man plant, the saptaparna, seven-leaved man plant. It likens the man to a plant with 7 leaves, each leaf representing one of the principles. But in this analogy, the plant has a heart, referred to as the heart of the man plant. Now, normally when we talk about the constitution of man, certainly in much literature, the 7th principle, Atman, is included in the list of principles, which makes life a bit difficult, until you realize that in her later writings she actually specifically excluded Atman as one of the 7 principles so listed, so computed. The 7th principle was no human principle, she went on to say, but was truly a universal principle. So when we talk of 7 principles, we can exclude Atman from this list. Well, that's a very good thing, because it would be difficult to imagine a hierarchy of whatever nature being responsible for endowing you with your Atman. How could it? Your Atman stems from the heart of cosmos. Atman and Brahman, as Yanti has told us, are one, truly so. So the 7 with which the dhyanis, these hierarchies of creative powers, are concerned, are these aspects of man's nature. Now, if we separate, at least in our thinking for the moment, the principles as being the modes of expression, the modes of functioning of man, then we can perhaps see that the dhyanis could be associated with and responsible for, or endow us with, those sorts of qualities. The nature of these beings, after all, is non-spatial. We are not concerned with spatial separation, with length, breadth and depth. It is quality which pervades cosmos and which saturates everything, one might say. And because we are saturated in the quality, the essence of these hierarchies of beings, so we partake of something of their nature. Something of what they are rubs off on us. We cannot help but be coloured by something of their nature. We are endowed with something of their faculty, something of their nature. This doesn't mean that whatever they are, they give to us in any way. It is just as if their nature is very pervasive, and so we can tune into, rather in the way perhaps radio waves can be tuned into, so we can partake of their quality. Principle. To say that we have 7 principles, then, says that there are 7 possible ways, 7 primary ways in which we might function, in which we as beings might function and express ourselves, quite independent of the atmic thread which is at the heart of the man plant. In order to bring these functions into reality, we now require vehicles. We actually need material modes of expression of those underlying qualities or principles. And these we draw from our environment around us. just as we have drawn our physical body from the substance, the living substance of the globe, this and the linga sharira, the astral body, constitute the material mode of our being. And that, I believe, is one, first perhaps, of our 7 principles. I don't intend to pursue this too far, but one might say that the second principle in our constitution, that which we normally call prana, can be seen as a principle in the sense that there is a vital mode of being, as opposed to a more material mode. And that vital mode is expressed through prana, which becomes its vehicle. It is the way in which that vital mode or essence is expressed in this world and draws on the vital energies belonging to this globe and this life. In another globe it will be expressed through a different energy, but it'll be the same principle in each of those. Moving up the scale, perhaps the next is a volitional or a will mode, a karma mode, and again will be expressed through the karma energies borrowed from the surrounding environment. There's a passage which we'll come to a little later on, which is asks, you might ask, where does our karma principle come from? Or where does our karma vehicle, in the ways that I'm explaining it now, come from? And the Mahatma's expression is his 4th principle is matured by his seriatim, serial contact with all the karmas, or energizing forces, of all the forms through which he has incarnated up to this point. In other words, we have borrowed those karma or volitional energies from all the forms of the lower kingdoms, animal, plant and mineral, with which we have already been associated. We have the principle, a volitional mode of being, needing to express will and desire. In order to actually give it expression, we required real energies. These we have borrowed, and these we must give back. You remember we saw in that passage earlier what happened at death? It said each of these things had to be returned to its source. Yes, because we have merely borrowed some way of expressing that for the time being. The body, it says, was wedded to and remains forever within the body of his planet. His linga sharira will be drawn into akasha. His jiva, his vital principle, will be returned to Fohat. So, yes, what we have borrowed we must return, but the underlying principle is still there. So, what these 7 most immediate hierarchies can do for us is to pervade our being with a quality which allows us to express that quality in a particular form. Now, it doesn't happen all at once. And the whole process of being human is the successive growth through this, what is referred to as the lighting of the 49 fires. Remember we talked about the 49 fires earlier this afternoon. Draw our attention to that passage in the Secret Doctrine. And that, the lighting of the 49 fires, is the bringing into function of all the 7 times 7 possibilities within the human constitution. And the process, as we saw earlier, is now going to take us 7 rounds to accomplish. And in each of those rounds, we make one principle in our constitution fully functional. In other words, we manage fully to express the capabilities or modes of expression of that principle. And we need to do that through a series of different forms, depending on the nature of that principle. We here in our 4th stage, 4th round, are in the process fully of maturing the 4th principle. Everything is foreshadowed and recapitulated, as in the cyclic process that we saw yesterday. So to an extent, foreshadowed is the development of the 5th principle. And what intellect we possess is that foreshadowing. But the 5th principle, as a principle in its own right, has much more to be developed than we have yet touched on. So these 7 hierarchies, who are therefore much more directly concerned with man and his existence, are those which are responsible, I believe, for endowing us with that intrinsic quality. Now, I suppose I should really stop there and quit while I'm ahead, as the Americans would say. But I'm a glutton for punishment, so I will go on just one stage further. And you might well ask, well, how is it possible? What makes us different, one from the animal and from the plant kingdom, if after all these 7 hierarchies are endowing us with these qualities which we may express in our principles? Why can't the animal do the same? What about the plant? Why can't it do the same? In part, we all saw the answer to that in what we said in the first session. We saw the process of the development of the life waves toward an individuality, a monadic individuality. There is, however, I think, another factor involved here. The 12 hierarchies of creative powers to which I referred a little while ago as being described in Sloka 1 of stanza 7 are directly concerned with where the monad comes from, if I dare use the word comes from. Comes from is a very dangerous word to use in this context. But you remember that passage right back at the beginning where we talked of the arhi, and it said of the arhi, then they exist no longer. They have long since become solar, planetary, and lastly incarnating egos. Well, ultimately that's you and I. We too, monadically, are part of this whole process of emanation from within outwardly. We, insofar as that we have become a human kingdom, are an emanation from within these creative hierarchies. We too have started from the heart of cosmos and have been endowed with the qualities of these various creative hierarchies of a high order, so that the monad already has within it that which makes it human. I cannot put it more succinctly than that. I dare not use any qualificative terms here because no quality applies to it. But something qualifies it in some way. A passage which, perhaps going off at a very slight tangent, might help us to understand something of the nature of this 7th principle in our Constitution is on the very last page of your book, on page 144, which passage again came as a very considerable shock and ultimately insight for me when I first read it in the Mahatma letters. The very last passage there, talking about the nature of man and his principles. And the Mahatma says, spirit or life is indivisible. Well, yes, we all nod sagely at that. Yes, we know that, we think. But he goes on, and when we speak of the 7th principle, in man this is, in this context, it is neither quality, nor quantity, nor yet form that are meant. Now just think on that for a minute. Now the quality, well, we know what quality means, don't we, in terms of our 5 senses: hard, soft, light and heavy, yellow and green. It's nothing like that. Nor quantity. There is no way of measuring it. It cannot be measured in any way whatsoever. Nor yet form. Shapeless, utterly shapeless, that are meant, but rather the space, and the emphasis is in the original, the space occupied in that ocean of spirit by the results or effects impressed thereon. And that's what you are, that root, that space on which you're impressed, those qualities.
They must exist somewhere like that, otherwise they couldn't be brought forth.
Space that was so different.
So, when we talk of the essence of man, the heart of the man plant, that, if you will, is not mine, but is the words I choose to put in front of you to describe the heart of the man plant that is undergoing this journey. And that relates back to the creative hierarchies that I started to mention to you earlier. And let's see. Oh, I was in the wrong place. No wonder I couldn't find it. Yes, if you'd like to turn to page 73, talking of these high order hierarchy of creative powers, I've numbered the paragraph 3 at the top of the page. Second order of celestial beings, those of fire and ether, whose name are legion, are still formless but more definitely substantial, whatever that might mean. They are the first differentiation in the secondary evolution or creation, a misleading word. Quite so. We mustn't talk about creation. Now, this is the important sentence. As the name shows, they are the prototypes of the incarnating jivas or monads, the prototypes of. And they are composed of the fiery spirit of life. It is through these that passes, like a pure solar beam, the ray which is furnished by them with its future vehicle, the divine soul, Buddhi. So the picture that I get from that particular last sentence, it is through these that passes, is a ray emanating from radiating, perhaps I should say, from the heart of cosmos, Atman. As it passes through whatever the essence of this hierarchy is, so it is endowing you with what ultimately will become the essence of your monad, sixth principle, Buddhi. So in a sense, this ray moves on and passes through successive orders, picking up as it goes successive qualities. So the monad, when it arrives for its cyclic journey, is already endowed with these intrinsic characteristics from these high-order beings. Well, that's enough of that. Quite enough of that.
Very good.
Well, I warned you it wouldn't be easy. I did warn you.
That's why I left it to you.
Well, you'd like me to jump in and make a hash of it, huh?
Well, excusing you, I don't think you could do much better because the information is lacking for more. You have to intuit so much as you've got. We're given facts, but the story stops short in so many places, so many loose ends.
I think this is deliberately so. Deliberately so.
This probably touches on some of the really deeper teachings that couldn't be given out,
Yeah.
I would judge.
Mm.
Do you think it's the misinterpretation of the phrase, the nursery of the human conscious spiritual souls, that led to this idea of man as a fourth?
I'm sure of it. Yes. And in the later writings, man is described as the fourth creative hierarchy, and I believe it is just based on exactly that phrase that it came about.
Because it's very clear when you come to the fifth, sixth, and seventh that this couldn't be the first.
Exactly so. It's a great pity that level of, I mean, it's a confusing enough subject in its own right, and to have had a misinterpretation at this rather fundamental level has just added a layer of confusion to the subject, which is a pity. But yes, I'm sure that's the case. Having said that much about the nature of these hierarchies as it relates to man and his constitution, we can finally, just as a last thought or two on this matter, broaden this out and say that the influences of these various creative hierarchies, now just looking at it in the most general sense, is all pervasive. Not only does it relate to man and his constitution and his principles, but it relates to every other kingdom of nature, and it relates to the cycles too. You will find that it is exactly these hierarchies which preside over, to use a term, each of the cycles and the cycles within each cycle. So the first, whatever it happens to be, globe, race, sub-race, round, will be characterized by one of these groups, and its influence will be the stronger in that particular period of time. Again, the passage that I started with, where it talked about each of the primordial human groups, you will find right down to the level of the first race and its polygenetic start in its 7 different groups on 7 different portions of the globe. Each of those human groups is under the influence of a different group. It is all pervasive. This 7-fold emanation from these creative hierarchies pervades and influences just every aspect of life in this terrestrial environment. It is absolutely fundamental to what we see going on. We get little trickles of it in things like astrology. Astrology, instead of looking for the influence of the planets and the stars on man, what we should be trying to see is the influence of these creative hierarchies on man. All that we are seeing with the movement of the planets and the stars is the hands on the face of the clock. But it is not the clock which influences it. It is not the clock which makes the time. It is the clock which is measuring time. So with the planets and the stars, it is not they who influence man, and to look for some form of physical influence emanating from the rocky body which moves round the sun or the far distant stars is to completely, I believe, misunderstand the whole thing. It is they who symbolize for and stand for, as physical representatives of, these creative hierarchies, down Chohan's one form or another, but their influence is not transmitted in a physical way. It is pervasive in the inner worlds, and it is that and the interplay of these forces within our nature to which we respond in our various ways.
May I ask a question? Be quite stupid. On page 68, the very first sentence which you...
68?
68, it says, the whole cosmos guides the whole empire, all the emphasis of our sentient beings. What does sentient mean in that sense?
Knowing?
Is it just knowing in some sort of sense?
Capable of feeling it, literally.
Sentient, knowing, conscious? That's all I believe it means.
use sentient just meaning living.
Mm. As little as that.
As little as that, there are places that it seems to imply just,
Mm.
but they're living, there's life,
Mm.
uh, which is vibrating, which is...
Mm. Mm. Mm.
Adam,
Yes.
following these ideas, do you think that the artists, the people that create, are very advanced in the way? Because for me, now we human beings are nothing but in the first stage of creating, like children when they go to paint something that we see, and sometimes we laugh of their creation.
Mm-hmm.
But we are creators, yes. But I think now that the artists world are a very advanced people, because they do create. They, for instance, a novelist that create a complete world there.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
Well-
a music, a composer,
Mm-hmm.
even a painter.
Mm-hmm. Sure. This is true. Artists, painters, musicians, and so forth, all are creators, but then so are we all. They have merely expressed it in a particular way, which we recognise, but so are many of us in quite different fields. And there is a much more general point to be made here, and that is that we are destined to become such a hierarchy of creators as we have been describing today. That is our destiny as a kingdom of nature, as the human life wave, as we mature and move on. So we will become part and parcel of these creative hierarchies that we've been describing. We are infant creators, and yes, sure, this is our infancy, and what we do now is nothing to what will come later.
I've been trying to imagine what the being of higher being in these hierarchies is like. You could have mentioned about the consciousness of the hierarchy or individuals within it.
Mm. What do you have in mind?
That it is the consciousness of the hierarchy and not of the individual.
Yes, I did mention that, did I not?
No.
A little earlier, not
No.
today, but on another occasion I thought.
Oh, you did.
You did with the text again.
Yes. Anyway, thank you for reminding me. Anything else that you'd like to raise?
It's in the book.
Okay, well, we'll stop there for today.